May 11, 2026. Somewhere inside a residence near Los Angeles, a 29-year-old man was found unresponsive. Within hours, the news began spreading across the basketball world. Brandon Clarke had passed. For NBA fans, it didn't make any sense. He wasn't a retired player whose name belonged to another generation. He wasn't someone basketball had forgotten. Brandon Clarke was still an NBA player, still under contract, still only 29 years old. And for 7 seasons, he had been one of the most recognizable role players on the Memphis Grizzlies. But to understand how shocking the ending was, you have to understand everything that came before it. Because Brandon Clarke's journey wasn't supposed to lead to the NBA in the first place. He wasn't a teenage superstar. He wasn't a 5-star recruit. He wasn't a future lottery pick everyone had been talking about since middle school. His basketball journey required patience, development, a transfer, a breakout season, and eventually, one of the best individual seasons in college basketball. Then came Memphis, the playoff battles, a life-changing contract, a devastating injury, then a comeback, and ultimately, a tragedy that no one around the basketball world saw coming. This is the life and career of Brandon Clarke. Brandon Clarke's story begins on September 19, 1996. He was born in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. His father was Steve Clarke, was originally from Jamaica. His mother, Whitney Triplett, was Canadian. Basketball would eventually take Brandon across North America, but his earliest years were spent in Canada. Eventually, his family moved to the United States, and that move would change the direction of his life. They settled in Phoenix, Arizona. That's where basketball started becoming something more than just a game. But Brandon Clarke wasn't immediately viewed as an NBA prospect. In fact, the player people eventually watched flying above NBA rims was still developing physically. He attended Desert Vista High School in Phoenix, and gradually, the athleticism started appearing. The jumping ability, the timing, the defensive instincts, the ability to finish around the basket, there was something there. But major college programs weren't exactly fighting each other for Brandon Clarke. He wasn't headed to Duke. He wasn't headed to Kentucky. Kansas wasn't building its recruiting class around him. Instead, Clarke's first opportunity came at San José State. And sometimes, that's all a player needs, an opportunity. In 2015, Clarke began his college career at San José State, and almost immediately you could see signs of the player he could become. As a freshman, he earned Mountain West 6th Man of the Year honors, but his sophomore season was when everything changed. Clarke took a massive step forward. He became one of the best players in the conference. He averaged roughly 17 points and 8 rebounds per game. He blocked more than 2 shots per game. He was named first team All Mountain West. He made the conference All Defensive Team. Suddenly, Brandon Clarke wasn't just an overlooked recruit anymore. He was a legitimate college basketball star. But there was a problem. If Clarke wanted to see how far basketball could really take him, he needed a bigger stage. And that meant making a very difficult decision. And that was to essentially start over. He chose Gonzaga. At the time, Gonzaga had already established itself as one of college basketball's elite program. This wasn't going to be easy. Clarke would have to sit out a season because of the transfer rules at the time. So for an entire year, he practiced, he trained, he developed, and he waited. Then, in 2018, Brandon Clarke finally got his opportunity. And what happened next completely changed his life. The 2018-19 Gonzaga Bulldogs were loaded. Rui Hachimura, Zach Norvell Jr., Killian Tilly, and Brandon Clarke. This was the season where Clarke transformed from a good college player into an NBA prospect. He averaged around 17 points, nearly 9 rebounds, and more than 3 blocks per game. But numbers don't completely explain what made him special. Watch the film. Clarke was everywhere. A guard drives toward the basket, Clarke rotates over, block shot. A teammate misses a layup, Clarke appears above everyone, put back dunk. Transition opportunity, Clarke is sprinting down the middle of the floor, lob, dunk. His game wasn't built around isolation dribbling or step back threes. It was built around efficiency, timing, athleticism, and intelligence. He became the West Coast Conference Defensive Player of the Year. He became the conference's Newcomer of the Year. And nationally, people finally started paying attention. Then came the NCAA tournament. For many casual basketball fans, this was where their introduction to Brandon Clarke. Gonzaga entered March Madness with a championship expectation, and Clarke delivered one of the greatest tournament performances in school history. Against Baylor in the second round, Clarke was unbelievable. 36 points, 8 rebounds, 5 blocks. He became the first player since Shaquille O'Neal to record at least 35 points and 5 blocks in an NCAA tournament game. Think about that. Shaquille O'Neal and Brandon Clarke. That's the company he had entered. Gonzaga eventually reached the Elite Eight before losing to Texas Tech. The season was over, but Clarke's life had changed. He had become a third-team All-American. He had become one of the most intriguing prospects in college basketball. And after spending years climbing from an overlooked high school recruit to San José State and finally Gonzaga, Brandon Clarke was headed to the NBA. June 20th, 2019. NBA draft night. Clarke waited. Zion Williamson went first. Ja Morant went second. RJ Barrett went third. One name after another disappeared from the board. But finally, pick number 21, the Oklahoma City Thunder select Brandon Clarke. But OKC wouldn't become his NBA home. His draft rights were traded to the Memphis Grizzlies. And looking back, Memphis couldn't have a better fit because the Grizzlies were building something special. Ja Morant was arriving. Jaren Jackson Jr. was already there. Eventually, Desmond Bane would join them, and Brandon Clarke became part of a young team attempting to establish a completely new identity. Before the regular season even started, Clarke gave Memphis fans a preview. At the 2019 NBA Summer League, he was outstanding. He earned Summer League MVP, and Memphis won the championship. It was the perfect beginning. But Summer League is one thing, the NBA is another. Now Clarke had to prove he belonged, but he didn't need long. During his rookie season, he averaged approximately 12 points and 6 rebounds while shooting better than 60% from the floor. And immediately his style translated. He didn't need 20 shots. He didn't need the offense built around him. He simply made things happen. Floaters, lobs, putbacks, dunks, rebounds, transition finishes. He played bigger than his listed size because of his explosiveness and timing. And alongside Ja Morant, Memphis suddenly had one of the most exciting young groups in basketball. At the end of the season, Clarke was named to the NBA All-Rookie First Team. Think about his journey. A lightly recruited high school player, San José State, then you transfer, one season at Gonzaga, 21st pick, and now one of the best rookies in the NBA. But the Grizzlies weren't interested in simply developing young players. They wanted to win. Over the next few seasons, Memphis began climbing the Western Conference. Ja Morant became a superstar. Jaren Jackson Jr. became one of basketball's premier defenders. Desmond Bane developed into an elite shooter and scorer. And Brandon Clarke found his role. He became the energy guy, the player who could come off the bench and immediately change the game. And during the 21-22 season, everything came together. Memphis won 56 games. At the time, it tied the best regular season record in franchise history. And the Grizzlies captured their first division championship. But Clarke's value became even clearer during the playoffs. Memphis faced the Minnesota Timberwolves in the first round, and the series became a war. Minnesota had Karl-Anthony Towns, Anthony Edwards, D'Angelo Russell. Memphis had its young core. But Brandon Clarke became one of the most important players in the series. Game after game, he attacked the offensive glass. He finished around the rim. He provided energy whenever Memphis needed it. Across 12 playoff games that postseason, Clarke averaged more than 12 points and nearly 7 rebounds. Those weren't superstar numbers, but playoff basketball isn't always about superstars. Sometimes championships are decided by the players who win the possessions that nobody remembers. The offensive rebound, the loose ball, the rotation, the extra effort. That was Brandon Clarke. And Memphis recognized his value. A few moments later, the organization made a commitment to him. October 2022, Brandon Clarke agreed to a 4-year contract extension reportedly worth $52 million. For a player who had once struggled to attract major college programs, this was life-changing. $13 million per season, long-term NBA security, and a place inside the core of a team that believed they could eventually compete for a championship. At this point, Clarke's basketball story looked almost perfect. He had overcome being overlooked. He had become an All-American. He reached the NBA. He established himself and he got paid. Most importantly, his team was winning. But professional sports can change in a single second. And on March 3rd, 2023, everything changed. Memphis was playing Denver. During the game, Clarke suddenly went down. There wasn't a dramatic collision. Nobody crashed into his leg, but anyone familiar with basketball injuries immediately feared the worst. Clarke had suffered a torn left Achilles tendon. For basketball players, there are few injuries more frightening. Explosiveness was central to Clarke's game. His jumping, his second jump, ability to sprint, his ability to finish above the rim, and now the tendon responsible for generating so much of that possession had ruptured. And just like that, his season was over, and the rehabilitation would take nearly a year. For the first time in his professional career, Brandon Clarke couldn't simply play through the challenge. He had to rebuild his body, day after day, month after month. Rehabilitation, strength training, learning to trust his leg again, watching Memphis play without him, and just simply waiting. March 27, 2024. Nearly 13 months after tearing his Achilles, Brandon Clarke returned to an NBA court, and immediately there were encouraging signs. The explosion hadn't completely disappeared. He could still finish, still rebound, still provide energy. For anyone who had followed his rehabilitation, simply seeing number 15 running down the court again felt like a victory. Clarke continued his career into the following seasons, but injuries remained part of the story, and by the 25-26 season, his availability had become limited again. He appeared in only 2 games that season. A calf injury ultimately ended his year. At 29 years old, Brandon Clarke's basketball future had suddenly become uncertain, but he was still under contract with Memphis. There was still the possibility of rehabilitation, another comeback, another season, another chapter. Unfortunately, that chapter never came. And so this is where Brandon Clarke's story becomes difficult. And it's important that we separate documented facts from speculation. In the weeks before his death, Clarke experienced legal trouble. He was arrested in Arkansas after a traffic stop and faced multiple charges, including a controlled substance related charge. But an arrest doesn't tell us everything happening inside someone's life, and we shouldn't pretend that it does. We don't know every private struggle Clarke may or may not have been dealing with. We don't know everything that happened away from basketball, and unless investigators or his family establish those details, speculation would be irresponsible. So what do we know? On May 11, 2026, emergency personnel responded to a residence near Los Angeles. Brandon Clarke was found unresponsive in a bedroom. He was pronounced dead. He was 29 years old. The news reached the NBA the following day, and shock spread throughout the basketball world. The Memphis Grizzlies released a statement mourning one of the longest tenured players on their roster. NBA Commissioner Adam Silver remembered Clarke as a beloved teammate and leader who played with a passion and grit. His agency remembered much more. They remembered the person, the teammate, the friend, the son, and suddenly, a basketball career that had seemingly contained more chapters was over. At first, there was no official explanation for exactly what caused his death. Authorities investigated, the basketball world waited, and nearly 3 months later, the answer finally arrived. August 7th, 2026. The Los Angeles County Department of Medical Examiner officially revealed Brandon Clarke's cause of death. According to the medical examiner, Clarke died from the effects of heroin and cocaine. His death was officially ruled an accident. He was 29, and this is where it's important not to turn Brandon Clarke's final moments into his entire identity, because someone's cause of death tells us how their life ended. It doesn't tell us everything about how they lived, and Brandon Clarke lived a life that reached places very few basketball players ever dream of. Look at the entire journey: Vancouver, Phoenix, Desert Vista, San José State, Gonzaga, Memphis. He went from an overlooked prospect to an NBA first-round pick. He became an All-American, an NBA All-Rookie First Team selection, a playoff contributor, a Summer League MVP, and a player who earned a life-changing NBA contract. He played 309 regular season NBA games, all of them for one franchise. He averaged 10 points and 5.5 rebounds for his NBA career. But statistics aren't why Memphis fans loved Brandon Clarke. It was the way he played. There was something almost chaotic about him. A shot would go up, and suddenly, Clarke was flying into the frame. Some poor point guard thought he had an uncontested layup, and Clarke appeared from nowhere. Ja Morant drove into the lane, and Clarke was waiting above the rim. He didn't need the spotlight. He created value inside the chaos. And for several seasons, that made him the perfect player for Memphis. And behind that basketball journey was a family. His mother Whitney, his father Steve, stepfather Brian, his siblings, the people who knew Brandon before anybody cared how high he could jump. Before Gonzaga, before Memphis, before millions of dollars, before thousands of people wore his jersey. They knew the kid from Vancouver who eventually chased basketball all the way to the NBA. And even after his death, the people closest to Clarke remembered someone much larger than his basketball resume. A gentle person, a loved family member, someone whose life had meaning outside an arena. That's easy for sports fans to forget. We see athletes as names, numbers, contracts, statistics, fantasy points, trade assets. But behind every player is a human being whose life continues when the camera turns off. Maybe the most heartbreaking part of Brandon Clarke's story is that it felt unfinished. He was only 29. His NBA career wasn't officially over. He was still under contract through the 26-27 season. Maybe he would have recovered from the calf injury. Maybe he would have returned to Memphis. Maybe another team would have eventually gave him an opportunity. Maybe he would have played another 5-6 years. Maybe basketball would have taken him somewhere completely unexpected. We'll never know. That's what the tragedy takes away. Not only the person, but every future version of that person's life. Every game that never happens. Every conversation. Every birthday, every responsibility. Brandon Clarke's life ended on May 11th, 2026. The official cause would eventually be determined to be the effects of heroin and cocaine. The manner of death was accidental. Those facts are not part of his story. They shouldn't be hidden. But they shouldn't erase everything that came before them either. Because Brandon Clarke's story didn't begin in that Los Angeles bedroom. It began thousands of miles away. A kid born in Vancouver, raised partly in Phoenix, a basketball player who wasn't considered one of America's elite prospects. A young man who went to San José State because the biggest programs weren't calling. A player who bet on himself and transferred to Gonzaga. A player who turned one season there into an All-American campaign. A player who scored 36 points in an NCAA tournament game and put his name next to Shaquille O'Neal. A first-round NBA draft pick, a Memphis Grizzly, a rookie standout, a playoff difference maker, a man who signed a $52 million contract, an athlete who tore his Achilles and fought for more than a year to return, a son, a brother, a teammate, a friend, and ultimately, a life that ended far too early. There's a tendency after someone dies tragically to look backward for one moment that supposedly explains everything. One injury, one decision, one arrest, one substance. But human lives are not that simple. Brandon Clarke's wasn't either. There were extraordinary highs and there were painful lows. There were accomplishments millions of young basketball players dream about. And there were struggles the public may never completely understand. So when basketball remembers Brandon Clarke, remember the entire story. Remember the number 15 running down the floor. Remember the putback dunks. Remember the blocks. Remember Gonzaga. Remember Memphis. Remember the comeback. Because the final chapter explains how Brandon Clarke died. It does not define how Brandon Clarke lived. Brandon Clarke, September 19th, 1996 to May 11, 2026. 29 years old, 7 NBA seasons, 1 NBA franchise, and a basketball journey that went much further than anyone could have predicted when it began. Rest in peace, Brandon Clarke.